How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to this video. Today we're going to be looking at Radix UI primitive components versus Headless UI components by Tailwind Labs. I've created a quick list on exactly how I'll be comparing Headless UI and Radix, so I'll just kind of write everything down as I go. I think it's important to address what a headless or primitive component library is. A primitive component library is essentially an unstyled component library that gives you advanced types of components with lots of styling capabilities, all unstyled by default, as I mentioned, which is kind of what headless means. It prevents you from having to do much JavaScript work on your end while also keeping them accessible to screen readers. The second part is actually quite important because when you create your own components, they may not be accessible to everyone with the correct ARIA attributes. React ARIA also tries to fix this problem, but I think Headless UI and Radix UI take a good modern approach to it, which I think you'll see throughout the video how they do it. So now that you know what primitive component libraries are, let's just get into the setup process for them. So I'll first start out with Headless UI, which is a library made by Tailwind Labs, of course the creators of Tailwind CSS. Now, if you want to install anything by going to the Headless UI website, you can click on any of the components that they have, and they have their small installation instructions right here. Of course, npm install, very basic, just one package, everything all in one, which is nice. Let's head over to Radix UI. The cool website they have here, but we're more interested in the primitives. Right here, it tells you a quick getting started section. So there is specific portions of the components in different parts of the library, so you can install those specific parts that you need. And what this does is it reduces your overall bundle size, which is nice. And I think that Headless UI, since it has very little components compared to Radix UI, which I'll also get into in the next point, it might not even need to have that kind of feature. And Radix UI, with its abundance of components, has a bit of a more advanced setup process. You have to install a lot more packages. I think Headless UI gets the point for this one, but might not be for the reason you're thinking. Okay, so now back to the component quantity. You can see I can literally count on my fingers how many components there are within Headless UI. There's not that many, but they also do include components for Vue as well, which I don't think Radix UI does. I think it's just for React. And what Headless UI does is it essentially puts down the very core components that are required, which are fully accessible by default. Radix UI, on the other hand, has a lot more components than Headless UI. You can see, like, I can scroll for a long time. But what it does differently is that it includes parts that you can style by yourself, but it kind of makes it a little simpler to do it through Radix UI. So for example, the avatar. Like, what is an avatar? It's just a circle with a background image usually, or it's just an image with rounded corners that has a square crop on it. The point goes to Radix UI for component quantity. The next part, as I mentioned, is component quality. So we'll take two similar components within Radix UI and Headless UI and just give a good comparison on how they're implemented. For example, let's take a look at an accordion. So you can create your own components through these libraries, of course, a very basic example. Let's just compare the basic examples here. So you can see we have the accordion root, we have each accordion item, they have their own header, and the header also acts as a trigger, and then there's content down below. So pretty similar in terms of hierarchical structure. Now, Headless UI has a very, very easy structure for this. You would essentially use disclosure.button as part of the trigger functionality, which also has the heading built in, so no duplicates right there, and disclosure.panel. Only issue is that when it comes to customization, maybe you want to set the trigger as possibly just the button or something, or maybe you want to make the trigger the entire title. Let's head to a different example. Maybe that might help us compare a little bit more. Let's head to the tabs. I think tabs are pretty useful. Okay, so they have a list, and then they have the tab panels. Let's head to tabs, and so in this case, I think Radix UI and Headless UI are pretty similar. They don't really add or remove that much in terms of simplicity. They both kind of win on that section. Now let's take a look at documentation. When you scroll down, you'll see all of these on the end. You'll see how they're implemented, and you'll see also styled examples as well, and a link to Tailwind UI to see how those styles can be achieved. On Radix UI, you can also show the code, go to a full code sandbox to take a look. And they also have the same kind of stuff, anatomy, API reference, and examples. Of course, their examples are a lot more limited, right? So in the traditional component library, you're looking at different types of interactions, different types of examples, and Headless UI, I think, blows Radix UI out of the water for examples, because Radix UI usually only comes with one or two examples, and I think that if it included more examples for different types of use cases, it might be a better option. And maybe a good use case would probably be custom animation libraries, which they do kind of address throughout. So for example, if you want to do like the force attribute, I can't remember where it was, force mount, yeah. So force mount is for React Spring, but what would be nice if they created a quick example showing how React Spring integrates with Radix UI, because lots of tab libraries have their own little animations, usually on the tabs themselves, but what if you want to animate the content between tabs? And I'll show you a quick example, actually. I did this on my website, MichaelJanaid.com. This was me using Radix UI with React Spring. So I click on a tab and it has that small little animation. Now those I couldn't use force mount for, and I had to do a bit more of an advanced solution with the transition properties in React Spring. So if there would have been nice if there was a good example there in Radix UI. And they also have lots more detail, such as in their introduction section, getting started, styling, animation, stuff like that. But for individual components, I think it would be nice to show different types of use cases a bit more. So let's just give that to Headless UI. Now let's take a look at the community. So let's go head over to the GitHub page. The community is very progressive on Radix UI. You have 5.5 thousand stars on this one, and the Headless UI has 16,000 stars. So you'll see that Headless UI, since it's backed by Tailwind Labs, has a lot more stars especially. And on top of that, Headless UI covers another framework, such as Vue, whereas Radix UI only covers React. Radix UI has been forced to kind of go in the path of Tailwind. And what you'll notice what Radix UI does is they don't just build primitives, they also build design systems. So this is their color design system of what they have, whereas Tailwind uses the Tailwind design system, right? Because they've already built a product called Tailwind CSS and it works out. Then Radix UI also has icons, right? Whereas on Tailwind, you can use tabular icons if you want to. Right? In terms of how many people are participating, Headless UI has 60 contributors, and it's a lot more than Radix UI. This one goes to Headless UI. I think the big problem with Headless UI, of course, is the first point. The component quantity is greater in Radix UI. You can cover more use cases, and in terms of component quality, or in terms of how much you can do with specific components, and the reduction of the bundle size, I honestly prefer Radix UI. Whereas for Headless UI, I feel like the big use case for that is using Tailwind UI components, which is the proprietary product of Tailwind Labs. This is Tailwind UI, and I think that this is probably the big push with Headless UI to get customers to go to Tailwind Labs. It would be a lot more beginner friendly to choose Headless UI over Radix UI. If you did like this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button and also drop a like down below, as well as comment on what you'd like to see next. And we'll see you in the next video.